"Tomorrow will be expensive," the quiet black woman said, her voice calm enough to disappear beneath the gentle hum of the engines, yet somehow heavy enough to linger in the polished cabin long after the words were spoken. Claire Whitmore barely looked at her before letting out a soft laugh that carried just enough confidence to invite the other flight attendant into the joke. The private jet smelled of fresh leather, brewed coffee, and expensive cedar polish, every inch designed to remind passengers they were flying far above ordinary life. Sunlight poured through the oval windows, stretching warm ribbons of gold across the cream-colored aisle as executives settled into oversized seats, checking stock prices and answering emails worth more than most annual salaries. Naomi Brooks stepped aboard with nothing more than a charcoal travel bag slung over one shoulder, a navy cardigan, simple flats, and the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago stopped trying to impress strangers. She paused only long enough to thank the pilot standing near the cockpit before making her way toward the cabin assigned on her boarding confirmation. Claire intercepted her with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Ma'am, I think you're confused," she said, extending one perfectly manicured hand across the aisle. "The charter passengers are seated in the executive cabin. Staff and support contractors fly on separate arrangements." Naomi blinked once, more surprised than offended. "I'm not staff," she replied politely, offering her digital boarding pass. Claire glanced at the screen for less than a second before handing it back without reading the details. "These mistakes happen all the time," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound sympathetic while making sure nearby passengers could still hear every word. "You don't have to be embarrassed. If you step off now, we'll help you find the correct flight." Several heads turned. A man closed his laptop halfway. A woman removed one earbud. No one interrupted. Naomi remained still, holding the phone in her hand as though she were deciding whether the conversation deserved another sentence. The engines outside continued, their steady rhythm while a baggage cart rolled slowly across the tarmac below. Claire folded her arms. "Ma'am, delaying departure affects everyone on board." Naomi looked around the cabin, meeting no hostile faces, only curious ones. "My name is Naomi Brooks," she answered softly. "This is the correct aircraft." Claire smiled again, but this time there was something sharper beneath it. "Everyone says that when they end up in the wrong place." A few quiet chuckles drifted through the cabin. One passenger exchanged an uncomfortable glance with another before looking back down at his tablet. Naomi inhaled slowly, her expression never changing. She had spent enough years walking into rooms where assumptions arrived before introductions. She knew how quickly strangers built stories from skin color, clothing, and silence. What still surprised her was how confidently people mistook certainty for truth. Claire reached toward the cabin door and gestured politely toward the stairs. "If you'll follow me, we'll get this sorted out." Naomi's eyes wandered briefly through the cabin, noticing framed safety certificates, polished chrome fixtures, and the airline slogan stitched into every headrest, every passenger, every journey, every time. A faint smile touched the corner of her lips before disappearing. She slipped her phone back into her bag, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and looked directly at Claire with a kindness that somehow felt heavier than anger. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll leave." She turned without another word and stepped back onto the sunlit staircase, her shadow stretching across the white concrete below as the cabin door slowly closed behind her, leaving only silence inside and a sentence no one on that airplane would fully understand until the following morning. The cabin door sealed with a quiet hiss, and within seconds the conversation was already fading into the comfortable rhythm of expensive travel. Claire Whitmore adjusted the sleeve of her tailored Navy uniform and accepted a compliment from one of the passengers for handling what he called an awkward situation with remarkable professionalism. She smiled with practiced grace, thanked him, and continued preparing the cabin for departure as though nothing unusual had happened. Outside the window, Naomi Brooks walked across the private terminal without looking back. The morning sunlight reflected off the polished concrete, turning every step into a soft glow that contrasted sharply with the cold silence she had just left behind. She reached the executive lounge reserved for charter clients, where an elderly receptionist immediately stood with a warm smile. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks. I was wondering if you had already boarded." Naomi returned the smile, setting her travel bag gently beside one of the leather chairs. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," she answered. The receptionist's expression shifted instantly. She glanced toward the runway, then back at Naomi. "I am so sorry. Let me contact someone immediately." Naomi slowly raised one hand before the woman could reach for the telephone. "Please do not." The receptionist looked confused. "But they refused to let you board." Naomi nodded once. "Yes. Should I call the charter office?" Naomi shook her head. "Not yet." There was no anger in her voice, no frustration. Only a quiet patience that came from years of understanding something many people never learned. Reputation was not destroyed in moments of conflict. It was revealed by how people behaved when they believed nobody important was watching. She accepted a cup of black coffee and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway. The aircraft slowly pushed back from the terminal, sunlight flashing across its silver fuselage before it began its taxi toward the active runway. Naomi watched silently as the engines gathered power. Around her, television screens displayed business news, weather forecasts, and stock market updates. Travelers spoke softly into wireless headsets while assistants reviewed presentation folders and calendars packed with meetings across the country. Naomi appeared completely ordinary among them. No designer jewelry announced her wealth. No security team surrounded her. No assistant followed with briefcases or schedules. To anyone passing by, she could have been another consultant, waiting for a delayed departure. Only her eyes hinted at years of experience quietly observing rooms before speaking inside them. Across town, inside the headquarters of Altair Executive Air, framed photographs celebrated decades of premium service, luxury travel, and customer trust. Awards lined polished hallways beneath carefully positioned lighting. Employees often joked that one unhappy customer could never hurt a company built over 40 years. They believed mistakes disappeared as quickly as yesterday's headlines. Few understood that trust rarely vanished all at once. It cracked silently, almost invisibly, until one ordinary morning exposed fractures that had been growing for years. Claire certainly did not think about any of that as the jet climbed through bright blue skies. She poured sparkling water into crystal glasses, chatted confidently with passengers, and replayed the encounter in her mind with growing satisfaction. In her version of the story, she had protected the exclusivity of the flight, defended company standards, and prevented an embarrassing boarding error. She never wondered why the quiet woman had accepted humiliation without raising her voice. She never questioned why someone who claimed to belong on that aircraft had walked away so peacefully. Meanwhile, Naomi unlocked her tablet, opened a blank email, and rested her fingers above the keyboard. She remained still for several seconds, watching one tiny reflection of the departing aircraft disappear into the endless morning sky before typing her very first sentence. The aircraft leveled above a blanket of brilliant white clouds, and the mood inside the cabin relaxed into the effortless confidence that money often purchased. Crystal glasses reflected the afternoon sunlight, while quiet conversations drifted between polished leather seats. Claire Whitmore moved gracefully through the aisle, refilling coffee cups and offering fresh pastries with the same polished smile she had perfected over 7 years in executive aviation. Every compliment from the passengers reinforced what she already believed about herself. She was not simply serving wealthy travelers. She was protecting an exclusive experience, and in her mind that required recognizing who belonged before anyone else did. Near the galley, another flight attendant named Emily Lawson leaned closer with a curious smile. "What happened before we left?" "I saw someone walking back down the stairs." Claire shrugged as she organized a tray of porcelain cups. "Nothing important. Just someone who clearly boarded the wrong aircraft." Emily hesitated. She seemed very calm. Claire laughed softly. That is because she realized she was caught before she made herself look even more embarrassed. Emily looked unconvinced but said nothing more. The captain's voice came over the cabin speaker, announcing smooth weather and an early arrival. Several passengers applauded lightly before returning to business discussions involving acquisitions, quarterly earnings, and expansion plans. Claire listened while pretending not to. Years of serving executives had convinced her she understood success better than most people who actually achieved it. She believed wealth had a certain appearance, a predictable confidence, a familiar wardrobe, and recognizable habits. Naomi Brooks had matched none of those expectations. Somewhere below, highways curved through green forests while sunlight shimmered across winding rivers, but Claire never looked out the window. She remained focused on the comfortable certainty that the morning had validated her instincts. Meanwhile, nearly 600 miles away, Naomi sat alone inside a quiet conference room overlooking the city skyline. A long walnut table stretched toward windows that framed endless rows of glass towers catching the afternoon light. Her untouched coffee had grown cold beside an open laptop displaying only a single email thread. There were no dramatic words, no accusations, and no emotional language. She described the events exactly as they happened, included the flight number, the names visible on employee badges, the scheduled meeting she could no longer attend, and attached the charter confirmation that had been verified weeks earlier. Then she paused before adding one final sentence. I believe the incident deserves attention because no customer should be evaluated. Before being welcomed, she read the message twice before quietly pressing send. The email disappeared into cyberspace without fanfare, without anger, and without demands. Naomi closed the computer, folded her hands, and looked through the windows as late afternoon light washed the city in soft shades of gold. She had learned long ago that dignity often spoke loudest through restraint. Across another part of the city, inside Altair Executive Air Headquarters, the final executives were preparing to leave for the evening. Conference rooms emptied, elevators chimed softly, and cleaning crews quietly polished marble floors beneath oversized company logos celebrating excellence and trust. The building looked peaceful from the outside, its mirrored windows reflecting a perfect sunset. No alarms sounded. No urgent meetings were scheduled. No one noticed the unread email quietly arriving in the private inbox of Richard Ellison, the company's chief executive officer, carrying a subject line so ordinary that his assistant almost left it untouched until the following morning. Evening settled quietly over the city, painting the glass towers in deep shades of amber, while office lights flickered on one floor after another like distant stars. Inside Altair Executive Air Headquarters, most employees had already gone home, leaving behind the soft hum of air conditioning and the occasional sound of an elevator opening onto an empty hallway. Richard Ellison remained in his corner office reviewing financial reports for the following quarter. The company had experienced another profitable year, and tomorrow's board meeting was expected to celebrate record growth. His assistant entered carrying a slim tablet and a folder of overnight correspondence. These are the last messages requiring your attention, she said before placing them neatly beside his laptop. Richard thanked her without looking up. One by one, he reviewed supplier contracts, maintenance summaries, and executive schedules until a simple subject line caught his attention. It read only, Customer Experience Report. There were no dramatic words, no legal threats, no copied news organizations, and no demands for compensation. Curious, he opened it. The message was remarkably brief. Every sentence was calm. Every detail was precise. It described a boarding denial, identified the employees involved, included the charter reservation number, and ended with a single observation about the importance of welcoming every passenger with dignity before making assumptions. Richard leaned back slightly. Something about the tone unsettled him. Most complaints arrived filled with emotion, capital letters, or ultimatums. This one contained none of those things. It read more like a quiet record than a protest. He opened the attached reservation confirmation. Everything matched perfectly. The passenger had been assigned to that aircraft. He frowned and checked the internal flight log. Departure had proceeded on schedule. No incident had been reported. He reached for the office telephone and called the operations manager. Did anything unusual happen before Flight 720 departed this morning? There was a brief pause. No, sir. Everything appears normal. Richard glanced again at the email. Appears normal is not the same as normal. After ending the call, he stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Rain clouds gathered along the western horizon, dimming the last traces of daylight. His reflection stared back from the glass, thoughtful and unusually uneasy. Meanwhile, several states away, Claire arrived home feeling completely satisfied with another successful day. She slipped off her shoes, poured herself sparkling water, and laughed while telling a friend over the phone about the woman she believed had wandered onto the wrong aircraft. You should have seen her, Claire said confidently. She acted like she belonged there. Her friend chuckled politely before changing the subject. Claire never noticed the subtle discomfort in the silence that followed. Across town, Naomi checked into a modest hotel overlooking the river. The room was elegant without being extravagant, decorated in soft earth tones with warm reading lamps casting gentle pools of light across polished wood furniture. She placed her travel bag beside the window and watched small boats drift beneath the bridge as evening settled over the water. Her phone vibrated once. A reply had arrived acknowledging receipt of her email and promising a complete internal review. Naomi read the message, locked the screen, and quietly set the phone aside. She neither smiled nor sighed. Outside, the first drops of rain tapped softly against the glass, steady and patient. Back at headquarters, Richard reopened the email one final time before shutting down his computer. He did not know who Naomi Brooks was, but years of leading a company had taught him one lesson he never ignored. The quietest complaints sometimes carried the loudest consequences, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he had the unmistakable feeling that tomorrow morning would not begin the way anyone inside Altair Executive Air expected. Richard Ellison arrived at headquarters before sunrise, long before the first executive assistants unlocked their offices or the aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the marble lobby. The city outside remained wrapped in pale blue morning light, and the quiet inside the building felt almost unnatural. He carried Naomi Brooks's email in his thoughts the entire drive, replaying every carefully chosen sentence until he reached the executive floor. Instead of beginning with the quarterly financial briefing, he walked directly into the operations center and requested every report connected to Flight 720. Screens illuminated one after another, displaying boarding records, security logs, passenger manifests, and surveillance timestamps. Within minutes, the boarding confirmation appeared. Naomi Brooks had indeed been the registered passenger. There had been no reservation error, no scheduling conflict, no duplicate booking. She had been cleared through every checkpoint exactly as documented. Richard folded his arms, saying nothing while the operations manager quietly scrolled through additional records. "Play the terminal cameras," Richard said at last. The room fell silent except for the faint clicking of keyboards. Grainy security footage filled the largest monitor. There was Naomi arriving precisely on schedule, greeting the pilot with a warm smile before approaching the aircraft. There was Claire stepping into her path. Although the cameras captured no audio, every gesture told its own story. Naomi calmly presented her boarding confirmation. Claire barely looked at it before motioning toward the exit. Several passengers turned to watch. Nobody intervened. Naomi remained composed from beginning to end before quietly walking back down the aircraft stairs alone. Richard exhaled slowly. He had witnessed customer complaints before, but something about the footage unsettled him in a way spreadsheets never could. There had been no confusion on Naomi's face, only dignity. She had never argued, demanded attention, or attempted to embarrass anyone. She simply accepted humiliation with remarkable grace. Richard turned away from the monitor. "Bring Claire Whitmore to headquarters as soon as she lands." The operations manager nodded without hesitation. At nearly the same moment, another executive entered carrying a thick presentation folder. "Sir, your 9 o'clock meeting with the Horizon Capital delegation has been confirmed." Richard looked up immediately. Who was leading their investment committee? The executive checked his notes. Naomi Brooks. The room became completely still. Richard slowly took the folder from his hands and opened the first page. A professional photograph looked back at him. It was the same woman from the surveillance video. Calm eyes. The same navy cardigan. The same quiet expression. Beneath her photograph appeared a short biography. Chair of Horizon Capital Social Impact Investments. Oversight responsibility for a multi-billion-dollar transportation and infrastructure portfolio. Advisory partnerships with several Fortune 500 companies. National recipient of multiple leadership awards recognizing ethical business innovation. Richard continued reading in complete silence. Horizon Capital had been preparing to finalize one of the largest financing partnerships in Altair Executive Air's history, a deal expected to support fleet expansion and several hundred new jobs over the next 3 years. He slowly closed the folder, his reflection faintly visible on its glossy cover. Nobody in the room spoke. Nobody needed to. The polished confidence that had filled headquarters only yesterday seemed to dissolve beneath the weight of a single realization. Richard looked once more toward the frozen image of Naomi standing quietly beside the aircraft door before giving one calm instruction that immediately changed the atmosphere across the entire executive floor. Cancel every non-essential meeting. We have a far more important problem than anyone realizes. Rain drifted gently across the city as though the sky itself had slowed to think. From the 32nd floor of Horizon Capital, the streets below looked softened beneath a silver mist, their usual rush replaced by quiet reflections shimmering across the pavement. Naomi Brooks stood alone beside the wide office windows, one hand wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since cooled. The meeting scheduled for that morning had already disappeared from her calendar. Her assistant, Rachel Simmons, entered carefully, carrying a tablet and several printed documents. "The airline has called 6 times," she said softly. "They are requesting an emergency meeting. Their chief executive officer says it is urgent." Naomi remained silent for several seconds, watching raindrops race one another down the glass before answering. "Did they mention the investment?" Rachel nodded. "Yes. They also asked whether they should send legal counsel." Naomi offered a faint smile, almost too small to notice. "I am not looking for lawyers." Rachel hesitated. "Then what would you like me to tell them?" Naomi looked back toward the city skyline, where low clouds wrapped themselves around distant buildings, hiding their tallest floors from view. "Tell them I received their messages." Rachel waited, expecting more instructions. None came. She quietly nodded and left the office, gently closing the door behind her. The room settled into complete stillness except for the soft tapping of rain against the windows and the distant hum of climate control flowing through polished ceiling vents. Naomi placed the untouched tea on the windowsill and opened a small framed photograph resting on her bookshelf. It showed a younger version of herself standing beside her father outside a neighborhood airport many years earlier. He wore a faded mechanic's uniform with grease still visible on his hands, while she smiled proudly beside him, holding a model airplane almost as large as her arms could manage. Her father had often repeated the same lesson whenever they watched airplanes lift into the sky. "Respect is never first class," he would say. "It costs nothing, yet some people still refuse to give it away." Naomi traced the edge of the frame with one finger before quietly setting it back in place. Across the city, Richard Ellison sat alone inside the executive conference room. The polished walnut table that usually reflected confidence now seemed strangely heavy beneath scattered reports and frozen financial projections. Every few minutes, another executive entered carrying updated information. Several strategic partners had postponed conversations until the internal investigation was complete. A public relations consultant recommended immediate transparency. Human resources requested authorization to begin formal interviews. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody blamed anyone else. The silence inside the room carried more weight than any argument could have. Richard looked toward the rain beyond the conference windows and understood something that years of corporate success had nearly allowed him to forget. Companies did not lose trust in dramatic explosions. They lost it quietly, one unnecessary assumption at a time. Meanwhile, Claire sat alone inside a small meeting room after landing from her return flight. She had not yet been told why headquarters wanted to see her immediately. Her uniform remained perfectly pressed, but her confidence no longer felt as effortless as it had the previous afternoon. She replayed the boarding encounter over and over, searching for reassurance inside memories that suddenly felt incomplete. The image that refused to leave her mind was not the conversation itself. It was Naomi's face as she calmly stepped off the aircraft without anger, without insults, and without trying to prove who she was. For the first time, Claire wondered whether the quietest person in the room had understood everyone else far better than they had understood her. By mid-morning, the rain had cleared, but the calm it left behind never reached Altair executive air. Sunlight poured across the headquarters lobby, reflecting brightly from polished marble floors, while inside the executive boardroom, every telephone seemed to ring before the previous conversation had ended. Richard Ellison stood at the head of the long conference table, watching new reports appear across the large digital display, one after another. Horizon Capital had officially postponed the investment meeting until further notice. Within the next hour, another institutional partner requested clarification about the company's customer treatment policies. Then a third investor delayed negotiations, explaining that governance concerns needed to be addressed before any additional capital could be committed. None of them accused the airline of discrimination. None threatened lawsuits. They simply chose to wait. Yet every delay carried a financial cost measured not only in dollars, but in confidence. The chief financial officer quietly adjusted projected revenue forecasts, while legal advisors reviewed internal procedures. Public relations specialists drafted statements that Richard rejected almost immediately because each version sounded defensive instead of sincere. The company had spent decades building a reputation for excellence, yet that reputation suddenly felt as fragile as glass. Across the city, financial news outlets began reporting that several strategic investment discussions involving Altair executive heir had unexpectedly stalled. Analysts searched for explanations. Industry reporters called corporate offices requesting interviews. Market commentators speculated about operational uncertainty. No one outside the executive floor knew the entire story, but uncertainty alone was enough to unsettle investors. By lunchtime, the company's market value had already begun slipping as institutional shareholders reacted cautiously to growing questions. The losses accelerated with every passing hour until the estimated decline reached into the millions of dollars. Richard stared silently at the numbers, filling the screen. He knew the market was not responding to a single boarding incident. It was reacting to the possibility that the company's culture had failed to match the values printed proudly across every advertisement and annual report. Meanwhile, Claire sat across from the human resources director in a quiet office overlooking the airport. A printed copy of Naomi Brooks's reservation confirmation rested on the table beside still images taken from the terminal security cameras. Claire looked at them without speaking. For the first time, she noticed details that had escaped her completely the day before. Naomi had greeted every employee with a smile. She had patiently presented her boarding confirmation. She had never raised her voice. She had never demanded special treatment. She had simply expected to be treated like every other passenger. Claire lowered her eyes. "I thought I was protecting the experience," she whispered. The human resources director answered gently. "The experience begins with respect." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment, and the memory returned with painful clarity. She remembered dismissing the boarding confirmation before reading it completely. She remembered assuming that appearance explained everything she needed to know. Most of all, she remembered the quiet kindness in Naomi's final words before leaving the aircraft. There had been no anger, no attempt to embarrass anyone, only calm dignity. At that very moment, Richard's assistant entered the executive boardroom carrying a single envelope that had just arrived by courier from Horizon Capital. The room fell silent as Richard carefully opened it. Inside was not a cancellation notice, nor a legal demand, but a handwritten invitation requesting a private meeting with Naomi Brooks later that afternoon. There was only one sentence beneath her signature, written with the same quiet grace that had defined every action she had taken since the moment she stepped onto the aircraft. "I believe conversations change more than assumptions ever will." The conference room at Horizon Capital overlooked the river, where late afternoon sunlight shimmered across the water in quiet waves, softening the sharp edges of the city beyond. Richard Ellison arrived 10 minutes early, carrying no legal team, no public relations advisors, and no stack of prepared statements. He entered alone, his footsteps echoing gently across the polished hardwood floor before stopping beside the long walnut table. Naomi Brooks was already there, reviewing a notebook while warm sunlight rested across the pages. She looked up with the same calm expression she had worn the morning she stepped onto the aircraft. Richard remained standing for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Naomi closed the notebook and motioned toward the chair across from her. "Please have a seat." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt respectful rather than uncomfortable, filled only by the distant sound of water moving beneath the bridge outside. Richard finally leaned forward, folding his hands carefully. "I watched the security footage several times," he said quietly. "There is no explanation that makes what happened acceptable." Naomi listened without interrupting. "Our employee made assumptions she should never have made," Richard continued. "More importantly, our systems allowed those assumptions to go unchallenged. That responsibility belongs to me. Naomi nodded slowly. Leadership always belongs at the top, she answered. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. I came prepared to discuss compensation, legal remedies, or any corrective action you believe is appropriate. Naomi looked toward the windows where a pair of birds crossed the bright afternoon sky before disappearing beyond the skyline. I do not need compensation, she replied. Richard looked surprised. Then tell me what you need. Naomi smiled gently, though there was sadness behind it. Yesterday, I lost a flight. Someone else could lose confidence for a lifetime. Richard remained silent. Naomi continued in the same measured voice. When I walked onto that aircraft, nobody asked who I was before deciding who I could not be. That is not a customer service problem. It is a culture problem. Richard absorbed every word without attempting to defend the company. Naomi reached into her folder and slid a single document across the table. It contained no financial demands, no settlement terms, and no publicity requests. Instead, it outlined a proposal for mandatory leadership training focused on unconscious bias, respectful customer engagement, and accountability at every level of the organization. It also recommended scholarship funding for students pursuing careers in aviation from underserved communities. Richard read every page carefully before looking back at Naomi. You are asking us to invest in people instead of paying you. Naomi nodded. Money repairs headlines. Character repairs institutions. Richard slowly closed the folder. The weight pressing against his shoulders since the previous morning seemed different now. It had not disappeared, but it had finally found direction. We will implement every recommendation, he said without hesitation. Not because it will improve our reputation, but because it should have existed long before yesterday. Naomi extended her hand across the table. Richard accepted it with quiet gratitude. The handshake lasted only a moment, yet it carried more meaning than any press conference ever could. As they stood, sunlight filled the room, reflecting softly across the polished floor between them. Richard realized that the most important agreement reached that afternoon had nothing to do with investments, contracts, or financial recovery. It was a shared commitment that every person stepping onto one of his aircraft would first be seen as a human being before anything else. 1 year later, the terminal looked almost identical, yet everything important had changed. Morning sunlight spilled through towering glass walls, washing the polished floor in warm golden light, while travelers moved calmly toward their gates with coffee cups, rolling suitcases, and conversations about ordinary days ahead. Above the entrance to the executive lounge, a new bronze plaque caught the light each time someone walked past. It carried a simple message that every employee had memorized during training. Respect begins before recognition. The words were not part of a marketing campaign. They had become a promise. Across Altair, Executive Air, every new employee now completed leadership and customer respect training before serving a single passenger. Managers attended the same sessions as frontline staff. Executives participated alongside mechanics, pilots, dispatchers, and flight attendants because Richard Ellison insisted that culture could never improve if responsibility traveled in only one direction. The scholarship program Naomi had proposed had already welcomed its first group of aviation students, many of whom had never imagined careers inside an industry that once seemed far beyond their reach. Richard often attended the scholarship ceremonies himself, choosing to sit among the families instead of standing behind a podium. He spoke less than he once had, but people listened more carefully because his actions now carried the weight his speeches once tried to create. Claire Whitmore had accepted responsibility for her choices from the very beginning. After completing extensive retraining and community service through educational outreach programs, she returned to the aviation industry in a different role, one with fewer privileges but greater perspective. She no longer believed professionalism meant deciding who belonged. She had learned that genuine hospitality began with curiosity instead of assumptions. Every passenger who stepped aboard received the same welcome, the same smile, and the same opportunity to be seen before being judged. On a bright autumn morning, Naomi Brooks arrived at the private terminal once again, carrying the same charcoal travel bag and wearing another simple cardigan that attracted no special attention. A young flight attendant greeted her at the aircraft door with an easy smile that felt completely natural. Good morning, Ms. Brooks. Welcome aboard. We are honored to have you with us today. Naomi thanked her, and stepped inside. There were no awkward pauses, no questioning glances, and no whispers among the passengers. Only the quiet rhythm of people preparing for another flight. As she settled into her seat, her eyes drifted toward the oval window where sunlight reflected across the wing before stretching into the endless blue sky. She remembered the morning when she had walked back down those aircraft stairs alone, carrying disappointment without bitterness. Looking back now, she realized the greatest victory had never been proving who she was. It had been helping others become who they could be. Moments later, Richard entered the cabin to personally welcome the passengers before departure. When he reached Naomi, he paused only long enough to exchange a quiet smile. Neither of them mentioned the past. They no longer needed to. The engines began their steady climb toward takeoff, filling the cabin with the familiar sound of possibility. Outside, the runway disappeared beneath the aircraft as it rose smoothly into the morning light, leaving the city smaller with every passing second. Inside the cabin, there was no applause, no dramatic celebration, and no final speech. There was only a peaceful silence shared by people who had finally learned that kindness was never a sign of weakness. It had always been the strongest way to rise.